The Legend of Zelda is a franchise that needs no introduction. Such a legendary series of games that revolutionised what adventures could be in the world of gaming, with fantastical worlds, lovable and iconic characters, and unforgettable gameplay experiences. Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess, Breath of the Wild, all of these games are icons of both Nintendo and adventure games as a whole, but how am I meant to enjoy them? There's no pixels in here! All kidding aside, these top-down style of Zelda will always be my preferred branch of the franchise, outside of the new open-world games they've been making recently, with games like A Link Between Worlds and the Link's Awakening Switch remake being some of my favourites in the franchise. This series though, like most others, was built on pixel art, so the long and storied history of this franchise, as well as this awesome video by Jan Measley, had me wondering, how many individual sprites has this elf guy had over this series' near 40-year-long history? So that's exactly what we're going to look at today, combing through every single console, handheld and otherwise that Link has appeared in, and gathering every single sprite that has been made for him, to see just how many times he's been pixeled. Now, we've got to establish some rules here so that we aren't forced to look at every single game Link has ever touched. So, I'm only going to be looking at games that Nintendo either made or published for the most part, or they at least had a decent connection to. If the game has literally nothing to do with Nintendo and isn't pixel related, we do not care. Past that, I don't really feel like adding any more restrictions to myself, because I want to find some really obscure stuff here. So let's finally start exploring the many caves, fields and dungeons of the Zelda franchise, and see just how many sprites Link has ever had. Starting out in the most obvious place we can, the original Legend of Zelda was released in 1986 in Japan, and across the rest of the world a year later. And this is obviously where Link's iconic design came into light, with his instantly recognisable green hat and tunic starting out here, and being a mainstay in his design up until really Breath of the Wild, where Link's design has only just begun to be played with. According to an interview done by GameCult with Miyamoto himself, Link's design started by making the sword and shield he wields very large, so Link's design had to stand out from them, so they chose to make his hat and ears longer to compensate. This led them in an elf-like direction for Link, which caused them to take a lot of inspiration from Peter Pan, who shares this green tunic design, with this inspiration originating from Takashi Tezuka, a video game producer at Nintendo even to this day. This origin point also helped considering the extremely limited colour palette for the NES, so green was a nice colour to have for the main character. It made spriting him a lot easier. Considering how simple and rudimentary the sprite is, you may think that there's barely anything to talk about here. And yeah, it isn't the most detailed sprite of all time, but there are a couple of unique aspects we have to talk about. Most notably the cross on the shield, which, considering this never showed up in the franchise again, and has been replaced by the Triforce in the franchise, feels super random and out of place. In my opinion, it was used for the shield because Hyrule as a nation hadn't been fully conceptualized yet, because why would it have to be? So the Triforce didn't have the same amount of significance as it would have later, as this overarching, almost religious symbol. So the cross was used instead as a kind of placeholder, as it's way more recognisable and easier to read, as well as fitting way better in the tiny sprite size of Link. Past that though, this design is just the starting point of this franchise, so let's add one to the counter and move on. Next up in the release order, we've got Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link, often considered the black sheep of the franchise, and one look at this Link sprite is probably a decent showcase as to why. It's one of the only times that we've seen Link in a side-scroller context, and with that comes a few animations that are pretty unique to it, as the side profile lends itself to a clearer view of Link's body and movements, even if they are still pretty basic as we're still in the NES era, and animations can't be very resource intensive. Despite that, this sprite has a decent amount of unique expressions and poses that make this version of Link very acrobatic and dynamic. Way more than the previous iteration at least, which is an element of Link's design that would become a mainstay. In the modern games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, Link is often seen doing backflips, a bunch of unique swords techniques, and so on. So this very varied and energetic moveset could be argued as starting with the Zelda 2 sprites, which is pretty interesting considering that not many people really remember this Link. But this sudden change in style is often seen as strange, especially in hindsight where this side-scrolling style was never really attempted again, outside of very small sections in the Switch Link Awakening remake, which are just neat callbacks at most. So that's what makes this sprite seem like the black sheep of the franchise. However, I think that it's important to look at this in context of the time it was released, where Zelda hadn't really established itself as this full-on action-adventure pillar, so it was far less weird for it to experiment with new ideas and genres. Mario 2, for example, at least in America, played with many different mechanics that switched up a lot from the original Super Mario Bros. So the side-scrolling and RPG elements were probably just to freshen up the gameplay experience for Zelda 2. And while none of it really stuck around much, it gave us some very unique animations that gave Link some much needed characterization and personality that stuck with him to this day. Now, you may be expecting me to move right along to the SNES era and start talking about A Link to the Past, but not quite. Instead, we're entering the era I like to call the Nintendo started missing being a toy company and started cramming Link into random trinkets for fun section. Yeah, Nintendo throwing out random toys and other crap is not a modern phenomenon with stuff like the Labo. They've always had a habit of taking their consoles and games on them, and wrapping them in as much useless plastic as possible, and selling it to the masses. And the early days of The Legend of Zelda were not immune to this. Spawning from this, we first had The Legend of Zelda Game & Watch, releasing in 1989, and being the final standard Game & Watch ever made. This scene depicts the Zelda 2 version of Link fighting a goblin while some Stalfos tries to poke you from underneath. I imagine getting a nice view of what's under Link's skirt. I imagine some people watching this would struggle to call these printed images sprites, but this thing is too weird to not count, so it's getting added to the counter, fight me. Also, a fun little detail that is completely irrelevant is that, for some reason, you have to collect 8 pieces of the Triforce, which officially makes this the second most annoying time you've had to gather shards of the Triforce in the Zelda franchise. Since we're talking about the original Legend of Zelda Game & Watch, I feel obligated to bring up the new one that was released for the 35th anniversary of the franchise, which included the original Legend of Zelda, Zelda 2, and most impressively the Game Boy version of Link's Awakening, which we'll get to soon. But being able to play all 3 of these on this little brick is a really cool thing for an anniversary release. However, to my complete shock, we've technically got to add 1 to the counter because this thing has a remake of an original Game & Watch game, Vermin, but with this Link sprite instead of the regular Game & Watch characters. Hey, if I'm gonna count the original 1989 Game & Watch, then this has to count as well. It doesn't appear anywhere else, so it's 100% unique. It counts. Moving back to 1989 though, and the second random toy that released during this era is the Nelsonic Game Watch. No, not the Game & Watch, exactly. Just the Game Watch. I know it's confusing, just stay with me. This thing is pretty similar to the Game & Watch games of the time, but instead of being a brick, Nelsonic made them into small wristwatches that you could uncomfortably wear, or play in the most awkward handheld format ever conceived. So yeah, the design is flawless. Weirdly enough though, the game on this thing is a completely unique LCD game, which sees Link in an actual dungeon doing something. Yeah, I can't tell what's going on with this footage. Apparently the goal is to first collect this boomerang to defeat Aquamentus, which then lets you get Link's sword to kill the Keese in there. But I genuinely can't tell any of this stuff apart. The screen is microscopic, so it's no wonder that this is considered the worst game of these two. Not that the standards are very high in the first place, but whatever. However, this thing does have a unique sprite for Link, so it's getting added to the tally anyways, yay! Okay, let's get back on track. We've looked at enough worthless plastic for today, so let's look at some way better plastic with the Super Nintendo, and finally talk about A Link to the Past, one of the most important games in the franchise. This game saw us leap from 8-bit to 16-bit graphics, and because of that, Link's animations have been given a huge upgrade across the board, with way more frames and smoothness that bring the character to life way more. Although the kinds of animations are slightly more limited than they were in Zelda 2, however, this is more likely a limitation of Link's moveset in this game, when compared to what a side-scrolling game allowed him to do. This top-down perspective does limit how many poses Link is able to be in. The addition of swimming animations when you get the item for it is pretty cool though. Onto what makes this design unique from the rest of them now, and the most glaringly obvious thing that sticks out to me is that Link has bright pink hair, a feature that never really came back for any other design. You may think that there would be some important or stylistic reason for Link's hair being pink in this game, like making the design more fantastical to match with how wild areas like the Dark World can be. But, unfortunately, it's down to a palette issue, where the Rabbit Link and regular Link have to share a palette, which couldn't include Link's proper yellow-brown hair colour, due to it mixing with the backgrounds too much. So the palette glitch that made Link's hair pink was never changed as it got around the issue enough. Despite that, I think that giving Link pink hair in this game is a unique addition to his design, that fits his bunny half when you're adventuring the Dark World. So while it may be a technical fault made a feature, it's still really neat to me. Also, for semantics sake, I'm not going to count Bunny Link as a separate sprite. It uses the exact same animations and sheet as the human Link. He just puts on a fursuit in his weird descent into the Dark World. That's not going to count for a separate sprite, okay? On to the next handheld game now, and we're looking at one of my favourite Zelda games, Link's Awakening. This sprite fixes the issue with the pink hair and just uses a black colour. For a sprite and screen this small, we really don't need as much detail that A Link to the Past did, so just using the outline colour gets the information across just fine. To make up for a simplistic sprite, however, the animation work in this game is quite a bit more exaggerated and varied than even arguably the Link to the Past Link, which had a lot of animations that felt quite similar, but the higher variety of items in Awakening, or rather their higher variety of uses, made the actions Link can take way more interesting to me. You see, a lot of the items in A Link to the Past kind of boil down to either hold this thing in front of me or swing or throw this thing, meaning that their animations could be reused a ton. But in Awakening, you've got Rock's Feather, which lets you jump with a front flip, a digging animation for the shovel, and a few more animations that make Link quite a bit more active and interesting to watch, making the gameplay more dynamic despite the tiny screen. Something else I appreciate about Link's design in this game is that it looks much less like a full body and more like a Link toy or action figure, which might sound weird, but let me compare it to the Link to the Past sprite to explain. You see, the Link to the Past sprite has very clear limbs that are always present and a key part of many of the animations, mainly in the arms being used for stuff like the bug nest and carrying objects, but with the similar animations in the Awakening sprites, the arms are a lot more simple and stubby in places, which gives off the impression that the Awakening sprite is more cartoony and almost like a toy, which fits perfectly with the dream setting. These design choices were carried over into the Switch remake, where they were literally turned into little figurines, which shows just how timeless and effective this kind of design can be when updated and changed into 3D. But I think it works just as well in the realms of pixel art, despite how simple these sprites are. With all of that, let's add the Awakening sprites to the counter. Okay, cut the music because we need to talk. You may be expecting me to move on to some more handheld games now, with the main series moving towards 3D with the release of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, so the handhelds would be the home of Link sprites for years to come, right? Well, yes, the Oracle sprite would be the next ones we have to talk about, but we have a bit of a demon to go over first. Releasing in the same year as Awakening, 1993, we have a pair of games that are infamous for their art. Games so hilariously awful, so incompetent and horrid, that they've etched themselves into history of the internet as one of the longest lasting and iconic memes of all time. I'm sure you figured out by now, so let's finally look at the sprites of the Zelda CDI games.
My boy, we all can't.
Yup. Despite how different and gross the art style of this game is, I'm seeing the same pixels you are, so we've got to count them. Let's start off with the regular game sprites before we get into the real doozy of this game, the cutscenes. Weirdly enough though, the design of Link in the game itself isn't actually too bad in all honesty. I feel like it's a pretty faithful interpretation of Link's designs that we've seen up to this point, which is impressive for a game that Nintendo themselves had very little to do with. The attacking animations are very stiff, yeah, but they work fine enough, and the design itself is pretty highly detailed for a goddamn SNES game, albeit with the Philips CDI attachment added onto it. The variety of animations is pretty low, only being a few different sword swipes and climbing animations, but it's genuinely not bad. A small detail that is kind of lame though is that for Zelda sprites in The Wand of Gamelon, this game's sequel, they just rehash all of Link's animations and slap a different colour scheme onto it, and slightly change body and call it a day. I was really hoping to see some more stuff here, but whatever. It still doesn't count because it's Zelda, not Link. What does count as an extra entry is of course the cutscenes of this game, as the sprites they use for Link are completely different from those used in the game. No shit. And these are, I mean, you've probably seen them a million times before. You know how awful these things are. The facial expressions are messy, the animations never want to sit still, which makes everything feel floaty and unsatisfying to watch. Like, every human being is constantly melting in this game. It's just miserable. But that's exactly what makes it so funny at points. Like, look at these dumb goddamn faces. His nose looks like a shoe. It's horrid. The characters in these cutscenes just look sickly, crinkly, and just gross across the board. It's wild that this game was ever shipped at all. However, when you start getting into this game's history and its overall development cycle, things start to make more sense as to why the pixel art is in the state that it's in. Daryl D. Sharon, the lead creator for these two games, was given quite a small budget of just $120,000 and a very small creative team. Most relevantly, a group of just 10 artists, 6 of which were flown in from Russia, meaning that not only did the team have very little chemistry as they had just only met each other, but language barriers and other differences may have harmed the team's efforts even more, making the artistic development of this game likely less smooth than it probably should have been, especially given the tiny budget that they were given. Adding to this, they were given less than 2 years to make both games, on the Philips CDI of all things, a piece of hardware that was not designed to make games on, with a franchise and IP that they were given extremely minimal details about. Needless to say, the fact that they got these characters' designs even this close is pretty impressive, so they can't exactly be blamed for how the art turned out. Okay, that's pretty much all I want to say about these games for now. I could go on about these games' pixels for a while longer. Hell, I could do a separate video about these things, so if that's something you want, tell me about it, but for the time being, let's add 2 points to the counter, one for the in-game sprites, and another for the cutscene link. Finally moving away from the SNES now, we move on to the Game Boy and the Oracle games, and wait, this isn't right. The sprite is exactly the same as the Link's Awakening one. It makes sense, I guess, they're on the same console, but it feels a bit disappointing, doesn't it? There's no real differences between the two versions either. Sure, there are some unique animations between the two, obviously the two main items of each game are different, but past that, there's nothing to add to the counter here. It sucks too, because the concept of these two games are so cool, having these linked adventures that are not only solid adventures on their own, but they also allow you to play them as one connected storyline, with the first game you beat giving you a password that makes the other a direct sequel, unlocking new content. It's so awesome, especially for the time, but it won't add anything to the count, so let's just keep moving. Next up, we're jumping forward a whole console generation and getting towards the GameCube, and looking at Four Swords Adventures. Now, these sprites are a little weird to talk about, as there are actually two versions of the same sprites we have to look at here. One being the sprites within the GBA port of A Link to the Past, which included the Four Swords multiplayer mode with these sprites, and then we have the GameCube version that's found within the Four Swords Adventures itself, its own standalone game. These two sheets have the same animations and overall sheet, but vastly different palettes that make the Four Swords Adventure sprites a bit less saturated and more detailed, as well as including slightly more complex shading as well, overall giving the latter game a slightly more serious visual feel. These two having the same sprite sheet means that I can't count them separately, but I think it's pretty cool that they have two separate feels despite this. It really shows how important and influential the colour palette of a sprite can be, and it plays into the overall feel of it. For the final Zelda game we have to talk about during this era, we have the Minish Cap, and from first glance, you may think that this is another Oracle of Ages and Seasons situation, where they just reuse the sprites from the Four Swords Adventure section of the Link to the Passport, meaning that there won't be any new sprites to talk about. But they actually took the time to update the sprites a bit for this game. The biggest difference here is the change in the outlines, where the Minish Cap has more stark black outlines than the Four Swords Adventure sprites, making Link stand out more from the backgrounds and environments, making the gameplay overall slightly easier to follow. Also, the Minish Cap sprites don't have Link always holding the sword and shield, which makes Link's body the clearer focus and increases the visual clarity of the sprites, at the cost of making the attack animations feel slightly more abrupt as the sword appears out of thin air, instead of starting out in Link's hand. It's up to you which one you prefer, but I just like Link having the weapon out at all times. It makes the sprite more varied overall. Despite that, it's still a unique sprite because of the upgrade, so add another one to the counter. And now, we enter a dark period for Zelda and pixel art. With the Minish Cap's release in 2004, the Zelda franchise as a whole would largely stray away from any games that use pixel art for its style, both on the main consoles and the handhelds. The incredible styles of Wind Waker, Twilight Princess, and even Skyward Sword left millions in awe, and the DS entries of Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks, while pretty unconventional in their gameplay, were still very impressive showings of how the DS could do 3D, especially when given the consistently unique and solid art styles of the Zelda franchise. Then the 3DS would come out in 2011, and with it, so many new 3D experiences would come out. Not only did we get modernized remakes of Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, but brand new experiences with A Link Between Worlds and oh god, not that one. One brand new experience became beloved in the franchise. But there are no pixels to be found here, which leaves me wondering, when will the next sprite show itself? Well, I am glad to say that the 3DS would give us one entirely unique sprite for us to look at, and the game that will bless us with it would be a goddamn Picross game. Yes, you heard that right. This completely random, dime a dozen Picross game that you could have probably bought for like £5 from the eShop contains the first Link sprites we've had in over a decade. Listen, when the franchise has become this committed to 3D, we need to take what we can get. This is a puzzle game that requires you to figure out how many squares on each row should be filled in, with each board eventually creating a pixel art image. And among the many images in this game, we have a portrait of Link himself in a massive 15x15 grid, adding one to the counter, and finally ending the pixel art drought of this franchise. I can't believe that a Picross game made it into this video, let alone such an impactful part of ending the drought that lasted 12 years. Oh, and as a neat side note, some of these grids are actually pretty fun, art-wise. We've got a Ganondorf that looks like a mech boss from Terraria, Zant looking like he's having a grand old time, and the most pissed off Goron you're ever going to see in your life. The art here is just fun, and finally adds one more to the counter. And onto the final game we have to talk about now. And this one probably has the most to say out of any game we've talked about so far, outside of maybe, unfortunately, the CDI games, and it probably has the best style out of any we've talked about in this video. This game is Cadence of Hyrule, and before you say that this is only my favourite because it's the most recently released, no it isn't, pay attention. Anyways, Cadence of Hyrule is a crossover game between the Zelda franchise and hit indie game Crypt of the Necrodancer, released in 2015. Taking the roguelike dungeon crawling gameplay that has been so adored across the indie scene, and combining it with a rhythm game, creating this unconventional and perhaps strange to learn gameplay that, despite the slight learning curve, becomes insanely satisfying to play once you get the hang of things, creating one of the most unique and fun indie experiences in the last decade. While the stellar soundtrack is what has given this game the most praise, the pixel art is also very solid across the board. Nothing insanely revolutionary. This game did need to work on iOS, so they couldn't be too extravagant, but it's genuinely very bright and fun, which fits the pulse and energy of this game. The character designs are all very unique from each other, from all the playable characters having a huge variety of body shapes, details and accessories, which all make great use of the very similar posing, and the NPCs being able to break away from this template to make some very interesting and fun designs. Some of my favourites being the shopkeepers with their massive hats, and the dungeon master wielding this massive trident and larger build. After the Switch release in 2018, the director of Crypt of the Necrodancer, Ryan Clark, approached Nintendo to ask permission to use Zelda characters for DLC for the original game, and the mutual interest of the two grew even further than that, eventually resulting in a whole new title for the Switch. And the visual style for this game would take a pretty major shift from the original Necrodancer, replacing the fairly standard pose that all of the playable characters had in the original game, and replacing them with way more detailed and energetic animations and sprites overall. Taking of course the Link sprite as our example, not only do our playable characters actually turn around when they move in different directions, where in the original game they would stay facing the camera, but the movement animations themselves are also hugely upgraded, being more bouncy and using the sprite's whole body far more, making it more lively. This game did have some of the artists that worked on Sonic Mania in the team, so it's only natural that the level of detail and charm has increased a lot. But these new sprites really do show how well the original idea and animation work for the first Necrodancer game was, and how much potential it really had. And with that final Link sprite, we've covered what I believe to be every official sprite that Link has ever had in the main Zelda franchise and its spin-offs, giving us a grand total of 13. Already a pretty solid number for this character, but I feel slightly empty about it. Like, yeah, 13 sprites for any character is a pretty solid amount, but for such an icon of gaming, there has to be way more across the world of gaming as a whole, right? Well, considering we're done with the main franchise, I thought it would be fun to scan as many games as I can find that feature Link in it, and see how many more sprites we can find here, plus a few more cases that I found that are a bit contentious. So, let's rapid fire every single one that I found, and see where our total ends up. First edge case, Link's cameo appearance in Donkey Kong Country 2 where he stands on the podium with Mario and Yoshi. This shows up at the end of the game once you beat K. Rool, and judges you based on how many DK coins you've collected throughout the game, and apparently Link has the bronze medal unless you beat him. This seems like a pretty clear-cut addition to the list, but hold on just a second, because these aren't purely 2D sprites, as these graphics are actually pre-rendered 3D models that have been compressed down into 2D sprites to fit on the SNES, while keeping the detail largely intact. So this thing was originally a 3D model Link, compressed down into a 2D sprite. So does it really count as pixel art? After some thought, I've decided that it should not count towards the counter because no individual pixels were ever placed to make it. It's all polygons that compose the sprite. So I don't think it quite counts for the counter. Moving on. In the original Super Mario RPG, when you decide to sleep in the inn that's in Rose Town, you can actually find Link sleeping in one of the beds. And unlike the similar looking graphics of Donkey Kong Country, these are fully 2D sprites that just navigate a 3D world, meaning that this EP Little Link counts for the counter. In the original Famicom game, turned into Game Boy game, F1 Race, once you start the circuit, one of many famous Nintendo characters could appear and cheer you on. And among that cast, we have what I imagine is the original Zelda 1 Link cheering you on, giving us probably one of the most obscure appearances of our main character. The many releases of Tetris on Nintendo consoles have some sprites for us to look at. Firstly, Tetris on the NES has Link here playing the flute for when you beat a Type B game, so that adds one right there, but his other Tetris appearance unfortunately doesn't count, as it's literally just a copy of the Zelda 1 sprite for the DS version of Tetris. Still, the flute playing sprite will still count. And with the final lightning round out of the way, we can add 3 more to the total to make a grand total of 16 unique Link sprites, that I could find at least, across the world of gaming. Although the last 3 aren't part of the main Zelda franchise, so depending on how you want to look at it, 13 could still be the final counter. Regardless of that, all of these sprites we've looked at today really show how far this franchise has come in terms of its art. Starting out as this very direct and not subtle reference to Peter Pan, with placeholder symbols on the shield, to one of the most recognisable video game characters of all time, that embodies the spirit of exploration and adventure that the franchise exudes so much of. There's been some missteps along the way, but the legacy and memories that these sprites have given to so many people have more than made up for it. And looking at every single one today has reminded me of that, and makes me so excited to see where they take these sprites in the future. And that's it for the video. I wouldn't say that The Legend of Zelda is a franchise that I have a huge personal attachment to. I haven't played anywhere near all of the games, and I'd only say I truly love about 3 of them. But I have so much respect for what this franchise has done for the world of gaming, and how its influence has made some of the greatest experiences out there in the gaming world, even now with games like Elden Ring. And I hope that looking at the many sprites of this franchise has shown you just how ever-present these games are. With all of that being said though, make sure to stab that subscribe button, and as always, I'll see you when I see you. Bye!